The Spaniards were trying to escape a city built on water when their portable bridge failed. Horses slipped, artillery, treasure, baggage, and men jammed the causeway, while canoe warriors attacked from both sides. By the time the survivors reached open ground, the invasion looked finished. Roughly 400 battered Spaniards remained, and the empire they had tried to seize had thrown them out. Yet within a year, they returned with a far larger indigenous coalition, warships on the lake, and a new plan to strangle the capital. How did a shattered expedition become the force that toppled the Aztec Empire? To answer that, the story must begin before the retreat, when a few hundred foreigners first discovered just how lethal and how vulnerable they really were. Early in 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with roughly 500 fighting men. He had only 16 horses, a few dozen crossbowmen and firearm troops, and several small cannon. Most of the expedition was ordinary infantry. Its famous advantages were concentrated in a tiny force that could not easily replace a trained shooter, an experienced horseman, or a dead horse. That small force soon met resistance in Tabasco. Near Chantla, broad lowland openings were broken by wet channels and marshy ground. Chontal Maya fighters pressed forward with bows, lances, and slings, some protected by quilted cotton. Their arrows and stones struck a Spanish formation that had to stay together or be swallowed by numbers. The Spaniards answered with coordination. Some crossbowmen and firearm troops loaded, while others fired. Sword and shield men protected the line. Cannon disrupted dense groups. The cavalry became most dangerous only after it reached open ground, where the horses could accelerate, strike, and turn away before being trapped. The attack killed heavily, but it did not make the Spaniards secure. The defenders kept pressing. The expedition had only a handful of horses and shooters, and every bolt, powder charge, broken crossbow, or wounded animal reduced what it could do in the next fight. Cortés then gained a different kind of advantage. Malintzin could speak Nahuatl and Maya. At first, a message could pass from a Nahuatl speaker to Malintzin, then through the Spanish castaway Geronimo de Aguilar in Maya, and finally into Spanish. That slow chain opened negotiations and exposed political divisions that weapons alone could not reach. The next test came in the highlands of Tlaxcala. The expedition climbed into cultivated country of fields, streams, settlements, and defended approaches. Tlaxcalan and Otomi forces did not offer one neat battle. They attacked repeatedly. The first pressure came as arrows, stones, and thrown weapons forced the Spaniards to close up. On open ground, cavalry and cannon could tear into dense formations. Horsemen charged, broke contact, wheeled, and came back through usable gaps instead of standing still inside the mass. Crossbowmen and firearm troops tried to keep a rhythm of loading and firing behind the infantry line, but the terrain kept changing the terms. A ridge, ditch, stream, or crowded approach could shrink the space the horses needed. The fighting proved two things at once. The foreigners could inflict terrible losses. They could also be worn down. Tlaxcalan leaders now faced a strategic choice. These outsiders were dangerous, but they were plainly vulnerable. And Tlaxcala already had its own long conflict with Mexica power. The Tlaxcalans were not subjects waiting for Cortés to free them. They were an independent political force deciding whether the Spaniards would be more useful as enemies or partners. They chose alliance. The change was immediate. The small expedition began moving with indigenous guides, porters, food supplies, standards, and much larger bodies of warriors. The Spaniards remained the most unusual military element in the column, but they were no longer the column itself. The coalition next entered Cholula, one of central Mexico's great sacred and commercial cities. Cortés claimed that an ambush was being prepared. Spanish and Allied accounts later pointed to suspicious obstacles, disappearing supplies, and warnings passed through Malintzin. The plot was never proved. The massacre was real. Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces attacked people gathered in the city, and the killing spread into plunder and captive taking. Parts of Cholula burned, but the city was not erased. Enough order returned for the march to continue, while news of the violence moved ahead of the army. Then the coalition descended into the basin of Mexico and saw Tenochtitlan. A broad causeway crossed the lake. Canoes moved beside it. Chinampas and settlements filled the water's edge, while temples rose above a city threaded with canals and removable bridges. The same system that carried people and goods through the capital could split an invading army into isolated sections. Moctezuma received Cortés with extraordinary ceremony. A later Spanish memory describes the Mexica ruler arriving in a litter beneath a rich canopy, surrounded by powerful lords and attendants who swept or covered the ground before him. The display showed the authority Cortés was about to exploit. Soon afterward, armed Spaniards confronted Moctezuma and took him into custody. Cortés later described the move as respectful and voluntary. Bernal Diaz remembered a much harder exchange, including Malintzin warning that refusal could get the ruler killed. The degree of consent is disputed. The result is not. Moctezuma was moved into the palace compound controlled by the Spaniards. For a time, the gamble worked. Moctezuma still received nobles, sent orders, and appeared to rule, but Spanish guards controlled the space around him. A few hundred foreigners had not conquered the city. They had captured the man through whom much of its authority flowed. That arrangement began to break when Cortés left Tenochtitlan to confront another Spanish force sent from Cuba to arrest him. He defeated that rival and absorbed many of its men. But in the capital, the reduced garrison under Pedro de Alvarado faced a population already strained by occupation. During the Taxcal festival, singing and dancing were underway inside the sacred precinct. Musicians kept the ceremony moving. Then armed Spaniards occupied the exits. Nawa testimony remembers the Spaniards spreading around the enclosure and attacking dancers and musicians. People ran for the gates, climbed walls, or tried to reach nearby structures. In an enclosed ceremonial space, blocking the exits changed the attack immediately. Those inside could not simply scatter across open ground. The violence did not remain inside the festival precinct. News spread through the city, and resistance formed around the Spanish position. Warriors moved through streets and across roofs, while canoes gave defenders another way to approach along the water. The same city that had welcomed the expedition now offered thousands of angles from which to trap it. Why Alvarado ordered the attack remains disputed. The consequence was immediate. The capital rose against the garrison. The palace compound turned into a fortified redoubt. When Cortés returned with reinforcements, he did not restore control. He returned to a siege. The Spaniards tried to use Moctezuma one last time, bringing him before an enraged population. He died soon afterward. Spanish and indigenous traditions disagree over the fatal violence. What mattered inside the city was that the hostage strategy had ended. The trapped coalition prepared to leave. Before midnight, in darkness, mist, and drizzle, the evacuation began. This was not a compact infantry column. Fighters, horses, bridge timbers, artillery, baggage, treasure, porters, and indigenous allies all had to move through the same narrow crossings. The plan depended on order. A portable wooden bridge would cover one water gap. The column would cross, and the bridge would be moved forward to the next. If the bridge stopped moving, everything behind it would compress onto the causeway. At first, the leading men and horses crossed successfully. Then the alarm sounded while much of the column was still behind. Whistles, horns, and shouting spread through the city. Canoes converged on the causeway from the dark water. Warriors attacked from the road, the lake, and the bridge gaps. Men in front tried to keep moving while those behind were still pushing toward the same crossing. Horses slipped, people pressed forward. Artillery, treasure, and baggage that had been worth protecting inside the city now slowed the escape. The portable bridge was lost or displaced, so the column could no longer solve each new canal opening the way it had planned. Tenochtitlan had defeated the invaders by using the terrain that Spanish weapons could not master. Broken causeways, removable bridges, rooftops, canals, and attacks from the lake. The retreat still had to cross hostile country toward Tlaxcala. Near Otumba, more open ground gave the few remaining horsemen room to move again. They were not a grand cavalry wing. Bernal later remembered about 20 horses around an exhausted marching body. The horsemen struck at prominent leaders and standards, trying to create enough disruption for the remnant to escape. Cortés reported that the death of an important opponent helped break the immediate pressure. The famous story of a named man seizing a royal standard came later. What can be said safely is that attacks on leadership helped the column keep moving. By the time the survivors reached Tlaxcalan protection, Bernal remembered roughly 400 Spaniards, 12 crossbowmen, 7 firearm troops, and about 20 horses. The exact figures were not a modern roll call, but the condition of the force was unmistakable. Wounded men, exhausted animals, little heavy equipment, and almost no room for another disaster. The titles 400 were not yet conquerors. They were fugitives. Cortés did not know how the Tlaxcalans would receive them. He was so short of provisions that he paid for food with some of the little gold that had survived. The Spaniards arrived as dependents inside an indigenous political center. Tlaxcalan leaders could have ended the alliance. They chose to preserve it. The wounded were sheltered and fed. Equipment was repaired or replaced. Contact with the coast brought reinforcements and fresh supplies. While the coalition recovered, smallpox struck Tenochtitlan. Nahua testimony describes people covered in pustules and unable to walk, rise, or even turn themselves where they lay. Caregivers and cooks also fell ill, so food preparation failed inside households. Some survivors were left scarred or blind. Disease did not empty the city or end the war. Tenochtitlan would still resist for months. But the epidemic hit while the capital needed to replace leaders, restore households, rebuild supplies, and prepare for another attack. The Spanish contingent, meanwhile, grew. By April 1521, Cortés could muster roughly 1,000 Spaniards, including 86 horsemen and more than 100 crossbow and firearm troops, backed by renewed artillery. The battered remnant had become a rebuilt specialist force. The political map had shifted too. Texcoco did not join Cortés as one united city, it fractured. One faction gave the coalition a crucial base on the eastern side of the lake, while other communities joined under pressure, rivalry, or calculations of their own. The lake still protected Tenochtitlan. Causeways could be broken, canoes could attack narrow approaches, and horses could be trapped. So the coalition built a navy. The 13 brigantines began in Tlaxcala as cut and marked timbers, while rigging and ironwork came from Spanish ships on the coast. Thousands of indigenous porters carried the fleet in pieces across the highlands to Texcoco. There, an indigenous majority workforce assembled the hulls. Even completed ships could not reach the lake, so workers dug a canal roughly 1.75 miles long, using local knowledge of water control to manage the route. The finished brigantines were shallow craft driven by oars and sail, with cannon for lake fighting. When they entered the water in April 1521, months of labor became 13 mobile artillery platforms. The second attack was a different war. Cortés divided the campaign among several causeway approaches and the fleet. Roughly 1,000 Spaniards now fought inside indigenous forces, numbering in the tens of thousands. Spanish specialists concentrated cavalry, steel, and firepower at key points. Indigenous allies supplied the overwhelming manpower on land and water, along with the labor that kept the advance moving. Their cannon could strike canoe concentrations, and troops could be shifted along the flanks of the land attack instead of remaining trapped on one road. That did not make the lake safe. Mexica canoe forces still knew the channels and shallow approaches. Defenders later drove sharpened stakes into the lake bed to obstruct the brigantines, forcing the attackers to deal with another obstacle before the boats could move freely. One early target was the freshwater system from Chapultepec. Tenochtitlan depended on spring water carried by low gravity-fed channels. Coalition forces fought for the line and broke it. Lake water still surrounded the city, but it could not replace a reliable fresh supply. Then the causeway assaults began to grind forward. Attackers moved toward bridge gaps and barricades under arrow and stone fire. Indigenous infantry provided the mass needed to keep pressure on the defenses. Spanish shooters and cannon concentrated on crowded positions. Sword and shield men fought at the crossings, where the road narrowed and the defenders could force the battle into a small space. A successful push was only the first step. Laborers had to come forward close behind the fighters. If the attackers crossed a canal and simply continued, the defenders could reopen the gap, strike the flanks, or cut off the men in front. The Mexica used exactly that problem. They reopened canals, rebuilt obstacles, attacked from roofs, and sent canoes against exposed sides. In areas where horses might finally have room to move, defenders placed large stones to break up the ground. On the lake, stakes threatened the brigantines. The coalition answered by destroying the city to move through it. Houses and walls were pulled down. Rubble was carried by hand and dumped into canals and bridge openings. Men who had just fought for a crossing now watched workers turn the water gap behind them into solid ground. Only then could supplies, more infantry, and eventually horses move forward without the same route being cut apart again. The pattern repeated for weeks: attack a position, seize the crossing, demolish nearby structures, fill the water, and consolidate the ground. Defenders sometimes returned at night or under counterattack and reopened what had been filled. The work had to be done again. Slowly, Tenochtitlan's greatest defensive feature was being dismantled. The canals that had broken the Spanish retreat were disappearing beneath stone and earth. On June 30th, the attackers learned what happened when that work was neglected. A force pushed too far along a causeway without securing the canal gaps behind it. Mexica defenders gave ground, encouraging the pursuit. Then they turned at a water obstacle. The men at the front suddenly had enemies ahead and an unsecured gap behind them. The retreat compressed toward the water. Men fell in. Weapons were lost. Cortés was nearly captured in the Spanish tradition, and parts of the coalition wavered after the reverse. It was a reminder that even late in the siege, the old geography could still punish the attackers the moment they moved faster than their engineers could secure the ground. But the strategic pressure continued. Allied towns kept provisions and military supplies flowing toward the coalition. Messengers linked the separated camps. Damaged boats and weapons could be repaired behind the lines, and fresh fighters could still arrive from allied communities. Inside Tenochtitlan, the opposite was happening. Fresh water had been cut, food routes narrowed, buildings and canals were being destroyed. Civilians, wounded people, and defenders were compressed into smaller districts while organized resistance continued. The surviving defense contracted into Tlatelolco. Its great market and surrounding buildings became part of the final battlefield. Open areas gave some room to horses, while nearby roofs and canals still sheltered defenders. Even there, resistance remained organized enough to force the coalition to keep fighting for ground, rather than simply walk into a dead city. By August, the coalition had taken away the capital's advantages one by one. Brigantines restricted canoe movement. Regional supply networks fed the attackers instead of the city. Causeways and canals were being converted into continuous attack routes. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc left the last defended area by canoe or boat and was intercepted by Spanish brigantine forces. Whether he was trying to escape or approaching in surrender remains disputed. His capture ended organized resistance. The city had not fallen to 400 Spaniards fighting alone. Those 400 were the survivors of the moment when conquest had nearly failed. Their weapons remained exceptionally lethal when terrain allowed them to work. But victory required a much larger indigenous coalition, a rebuilt Spanish specialist force, and a months-long siege against a city already damaged by epidemic disease. The lake that had trapped the retreating Spaniards now carried the coalition's warships. The canals that had broken their escape were filled with the city's own rubble. A shattered expedition returned as the lethal spear point of a much larger indigenous war, and that was the force Tenochtitlan could no longer survive.